All right. Hello. I'm Charles Gies, as you all have seen.
Mr. Charles. Mr. Charles.
Yeah, hi.
1 second.
Hi, Nita.
1 second.
Okay, you let me know when you're ready for me to start.
I want to do a quick introduction before you get started.
Okay, you go ahead.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's live, where we will be talking with, Mr. Charles will be sharing his journey with autism. As you guys know, he has been on this journey, officially 49, but he's always on the spectrum. He is 78 years old, or 78 years. We're going to allow Mr. Charles to talk, and then I'm going to put the questions up on the screen after he's done. Okay, I'm going to disappear, and I'll see you guys in a minute.
Okay, I'm sure, too, you'll tell me what the questions are from the TikTok side.
Yeah.
Okay, that's cool. Okay. As Anita introduced me, I'm Charlie Gies. I grew up at a time when very little was known about autism, and there's been some talk in the news about how there's been a huge increase in autism diagnoses, and a lot of controversy about whether there's some environmental factor contributing to this or whether it's just better diagnosis. And the fact is, when I was growing up, very little was known about autism. In fact, a lot of people had never heard of it. Now, my parents, Joseph and Frances Gies, they were both historians. They wrote a number of books, particularly dealing with the human side of medieval history. So, ever Google their names, Frances and Joseph Gies, you'll find some of their books there. I'm the oldest child in my family, oldest of three, two surviving. At an early age, my parents began noticing my mathematical ability. It was one of the early signs. Of course, they didn't recognize it as a sign of anything then. But when I was 4 years old, I was playing with some toy bricks, and my mom saw me discovering that 1 and 1 is 2, and 2 and 2 is 4. So she started asking me addition questions, and I got them all right until she got up to 4 and 5, and I got that one wrong. Said it was 8, but from that point on, my mom and dad worked with me on the math. But the other thing I noticed is the difficulties I had socializing with other kids, difficulty in fitting in, and I became aware when I got to kindergarten. The teacher had the kids singing these songs, and I'd never heard of them. Hi, Dinah. These songs I'd never heard, and I couldn't follow along with the other kids because they didn't know the songs. Apparently, the other kids were picking up with the songs right away, and I wasn't. And that was what that was. But then there was the incident that caused me to miss most of kindergarten. One day on the way to school, the school bus got into a fender bender accident. Nobody was hurt or anything, but the bus driver shut us kids up in the bus for a long time while he talked with the other driver and with a police officer. And that frightened me because we were shut up in that bus, and I cried nonstop. And after that, I wouldn't get on a bus. And it wasn't until it was months before I would get on a school bus again. So not until near the end of the year did I get another school bus and go back to kindergarten. I missed most of kindergarten, which back then wasn't really much. Kindergarten was mostly about social activities. It wasn't about learning anything. It wasn't like it is now, where the kids get homework in kindergarten. But anyway, then first grade, first few days of the first grade, I wasn't paying any attention to what the teacher was doing. She passed out a large sheet of paper on the first day of school, and I don't know what we were supposed to do, maybe draw something, because a lot of kids entered first grade not knowing how to read and write back then. But in any case, I filled it up, counting by 76s up to 7,600. And the teacher looked at that paper and she said, well, I never. Well, eventually it was some letters she wrote to my mom and so on. They got me paying attention in class, which was good. But still, I wasn't always paying full attention. There was at one point there was a fire drill, and I wasn't following instructions. I was off somewhere else, but the class was over here. The teacher tried to tell me, what if there was a fire, and I couldn't understand what the fuss was up, because there wasn't a fire. But and then at one point there too, I was sick. I had a sore throat and a low-grade fever. Well, that time we had a pediatrician that was friendly with the family, and he came over to the house, and anyway, he examined me, and then he put this glass of water down on the floor next to the sofa where I was laying, and told me to bend down and pick up that glass of water. Well, I, at the time, didn't drink from any glasses that didn't have designs on them, and that was just a plain glass, so I wouldn't bend down and pick the glass up. And the doctor and my mom both thought I couldn't bend down and pick it up. And so as the doctor was going out the door, I heard my mom say, well, then I guess he must have polio. I didn't know what polio was, but later that day, that doctor came back, the nurse and some other people, and they put me face down on the dining room table, and they started poking my spine with needles, expecting fluid to gush out. And I was screaming. And they eventually figured out that all I had was tonsillitis, and they gave me a penicillin shot for that, which cured that. And I tolerated the shot a lot better than tolerating having them poke my spine. And there were times when that was true too. And I got upset about things, and it was hard for me to communicate to others, even though I was verbal. But still, there's a difference between being verbal and being articulate. Communicating your ideas well to others. And so sometimes others found it difficult to understand what my problem was with something. And I'm about to relate something that illustrates that quite well. And this is what led my mom to take me to a psychiatrist. And that's that. At first, we were doing double sessions in the school. We went to school from noon to 4 o'clock. I did, and other kids went from 8 until noon. And so at first they had 2 bathroom breaks during our school day. Later they had just 1 class bathroom break. Well, I had the idea that was the only time that you were supposed to use the school restrooms, during the class bathroom break. And so eventually there were some times that I needed to go, and I couldn't wait till later. I was wet or dirtied my pants in class, and they couldn't understand what my problem was. The problem was I was convinced that you can only use the school restroom during a class bathroom break, and that was the problem. Anyway, Mom, in advance of the visit to the child psychiatrist, she wrote him a letter in which she detailed all the odd things she had observed about me, even things like my thinking I didn't have to dress warmly on a cold spring day because it was past a certain date of the year. and never mind that it was a cold day that day. Things like that she mentioned, and she went through the whole 9 yards. But that psychiatrist read just the first paragraph, where she started out with the immediate issue that drove the visit. And on the basis of that paragraph, he issued a dismissive diagnosis. He said the problem was all Mom's fault because she was obsessed with toilet training. And that had nothing to do with it. I was fully toilet trained. It was as though the school restrooms were padlocked when there wasn't a class bathroom break in progress. That was what the problem was. But and here was a golden opportunity. Here he had the facts before him and could have investigated. This is what separates the Isaac Newtons and the Michael Faradays from the run-of-the-mill scientists. But anyway, my relationship with my dad was good, and he too was concerned about the differences. Of course, Mom being a stay-at-home mom, she saw the things about me at much more and at a close range than he did. But I had a good relationship with Dad all along. And eventually I learned to swim. I didn't learn to swim till I was 13. And so, but when I did, that was a good thing, though, learning to swim. But until then, I was afraid to try. And then one day we were at Lake Michigan and on vacation, and my mom noticed that I was swimming and told me, and from that I gradually learned more about how to swim. But getting back to where I was, though, after first grade, during that summer, I resolved that I would ask to use the bathroom if I needed to go. And from then on, I had no more toilet accidents in school from second grade on. But and then after second grade, we moved from where we lived. We lived on Long Island at the time. And we moved to Connecticut, and this made me more keenly aware of how I just wasn't fitting in with other kids. I couldn't navigate the social scene, and there were oddities about my behavior that contributed, though, to that. Like at some point, I think when I was about 6 years old or so, I decided I didn't like to eat with a fork because I didn't like the holes that a fork made in food. Well, that became an issue when I got to third grade, because now I was going to school from like 9 to 3, and so we had a hot lunch, and with the hot lunch they gave us the utensils that were appropriate for whatever happened to be on the menu that day. And so if there wasn't anything that you normally eat with a spoon, we didn't get spoons. We got just forks. And so I would eat with my hands. The other kids would be telling me, eat with a fork, not with your hands. At some point when I was in fourth grade, I decided, okay, I'm going to start eating with a fork. And then I decided spoons were for babies, and I would insist on eating everything with a fork. I think I must have made some exceptions, like for soup. You can't eat soup with a fork. I must have used a spoon for that, but just about everything else, even ice cream, I ate with a fork. And so, and that I finally snapped out of, I think, when I got into my late teens. I think when I started drinking coffee, I started using spoons again. But the teachers noticed that I was way ahead of all the other kids in math. Like when I started first grade, I already could do long division, when other kids were just learning to add. And so finally in fifth grade, one day when I was in fifth grade, the school principal came up to me in the cafeteria during lunch and gave me a geometry problem, showed me a geometric figure with the lengths of some of the lines, and asked me to figure out the length of this dotted line. And I didn't know how to figure it out. So he said, well, come to my office half hour before school ends, I'll teach you geometry. And he took a half hour out of his busy day every day for me to come to his office, and he would teach me geometry while my fifth grade teacher was teaching fifth grade math to the other kids. And then at the end of the year, he gave me the geometry textbook to take home, and I finished studying it over summer vacation that year. And then sixth grade teacher gave me some algebra books, and an algebra book that I was able to study while the other kids were doing sixth grade math. So that helped. And then seventh grade got into junior high. So now it was a flexible schedule. Of course, I had to get used to moving between classes, but they had me taking algebra 2, and then math 12 in eighth grade they had me taking. So that way, I was able to get math courses that challenged me. But they ran out of that after eighth grade, so I had to take correspondence courses from the college. Now, I was able to make friends with a couple of younger boys, and so I was able to have some social interaction there. But there were other things too that, the difficulty in understanding. There was an eighth grade English teacher I had that had the hardest problem communicating with her. And of course, when the two people have difficulty understanding each other, it's almost always mutual. And it was there that I remember I turned in, we had a quiz early in the year on a short story that we read, and she gave me a failing grade on that. And I approached her after the class, and she told me I needed to give examples. Well, subsequently in a test, we had some questions dealing with the same short story, so I endeavored to give examples, and she marked me off for retelling the story. Well, years later, looking back, I think now I realize what her real problem was. Is she didn't understand my answers. When she looked at the quiz, she concluded I hadn't read the story and was just making these answers up. But when she read my answers in the test, she still didn't understand where I was coming from. She saw I read the story, so to her, I was just retelling the story. She still didn't make sense out of my answers. That was the real problem. But, there was another assignment that she gave. I didn't know what she wanted us to do, and I ended up getting a 0 on it. But other teachers, though, some other teachers that I connected with well, generally with math and science teachers, I connected well with them. But, or another thing that illustrates that one time I was in a movie theater. Back then, movie theaters, some of them had soda vending machines. Whereas now you go to the counter to get your soda pop. But back then, this one had a vending machine. They had a sign on the vending machine that said, please do not take the drinks to the seats. And so I got my drink from the machine and went into the theater and stood in the aisle sipping my drink. And I thought that was okay because I wasn't taking it to the seats. And this usher comes up and she asked me, what's the matter with you? Can't you read? And, I think she must have thought I was being smart alecky when I said, but the sign said to the seats. But again, it's, taking things too literally. Now, when other kids were dating, I found I couldn't navigate the dating scene to, I started listening to the popular music other kids were listening to, but instead of learning the dance steps and so on, I would track the top 40 and try to keep track every week of the top 40 and how the hits moved on the chart. That became a weekly routine of mine. I also enjoyed reading mystery stories, and I read most of the Perry Mason stories, read a lot of the other Earl Stanley Gardner mysteries as well, and I read quite a few of the Agatha Christie books. I read most of them. the Mike Shane Mysteries by Brett Halliday. Now, my mom had taken me to a couple of other mental health professionals when I was in like 4th grade and 6th grade, and they too found other ways of blaming mom for my problems. But then in 10th grade, she took me to a psychiatrist, and he said, no, he told mom, no, you didn't cause this. This is a bigger thing than that. But he was expensive, and he was more expensive than my parents could really afford to pay for. So, but then they found a pair of psychologists that they could afford that were in a nearby town of Norwalk, Connecticut. And so mom and I made weekly visits to these psychologists during my senior year of high school. And they helped me with a lot of things. They helped me with how to handle a lot of situations at home, gave me tips on nutrition and on exercising. And so that was good for me. In 12th grade, I remember coming back. I'd just come back from surgery. I'd had hernia surgery. Just come back to the school, and another kid in my homeroom tells me, you got to get right down to the cafeteria for the math contest. And so I did, and it was the national math contest, and I got back to school just in time for it. And I ended up placing first in the state of Connecticut in that math contest. And so I was that maybe a celebrity. I also started reading Playboy magazine, and I got all into its philosophy. Thought its philosophy was the greatest thing since sliced cheese. But I couldn't make it work for me. But nevertheless, it was the greatest thing since sliced cheese, as far as I was concerned. I had difficulty understanding other people's points of view, and other people, didn't see things my way. When I got to college, one thing that helped with social interaction is I saw some guys playing bid whist. Bid whist, for those that aren't familiar with it, it's a card game popular with African Americans. And anyway, I saw guys playing bid whist, and because I had played bridge, I knew how to play bridge. I was able to pick up how to play bid whist pretty quickly, and soon I was playing bid whist with them. And when you run a boss, and that is you make all the books, then we would get up and jog around the room, and so that gave me some social interaction in college. And I joined the campus NAACP. At the end of my freshman year of college, another guy in my dorm took me aside and gave me a bunch of really good advice. Look at people when talking with them. Advice on how to dress and so on. And this was some help to me. And I also briefly dated a young woman. I was in college. So I got some exposure to the dating scene. And during the summer between my junior and senior years of college, my family moved from Connecticut to Illinois, to the Chicago area. So that was an event in my life. Well, now, one thing though that a big change in my life, and a change that's affected the last 57 years of my life particularly, is that I began having discussions with Jehovah's Witnesses I was in my junior year of college, and I had a lot of questions. I'd always been raised to believe that we were the product of evolution, and so it took some research for me to see that that the creation account made sense to me, and to be convinced of that. But a big difference that's made to me is an introduction to a global brotherhood. I could go to the Kingdom Hall and be accepted, and taught me guiding principles, love of neighbor, being patient with others, being reasonable. And these are things I've had to gradually learn too. These aren't things you just become overnight. Things that's taken a while, and it's given me an outlook on life that, even if I don't understand where others are coming from, I understand that they are coming from a different direction. And also, now I became less anxious about dating. I came to view dating as something you do when you're looking to get married. And I was still in college, wasn't ready to get married yet. But then finding my first job, that took several months to get that first job. And, a lot of things I was doing wrong. Finally, an employment agent gave me some advice. Basically showed me the things that I needed to do, starting from the handshake, the first impression, and the things I needed to say. And I also came to realize that some questions in the application are really kind of trick questions. And an example, in asking about college, they ask you what 3 courses were most valuable to you and what 3 courses were least valuable to you. Well, the most valuable courses, what they want to hear is courses related to the job you're applying for. If you mention other things, that will tell them that, hey, this person just wants to do this until he can find something better that's more in his line of interest. And the least valuable, it's best probably to leave that blank, because those things just raise questions. Well, why did you take this course? And best just to leave that blank. Say, no, there weren't really any courses that weren't valuable to me. But during my interviews for different computer programming jobs, because that was what the thing was, I would have liked to get a job that would have used my math, but the problem was that there were massive layoffs in the aerospace industry right around the time I graduated. And so the job market was flooded with experienced mathematicians and scientists. And so it was the computer programming I studied in college that proved useful. And finally, after taking this logic test a number of times, I learned to get a perfect score on it. And that's what helped get me my first job, computer programming job with an insurance company in Chicago. And so, that's where I would work for 6 years then. And then, and that job, that was near on the north side of Chicago, near the lakefront. So I found an apartment 4 blocks away on Sheridan Road, just a block from Lake Michigan, and nice apartment. And then it was after that at a religious assembly that some friends introduced me to a young lady, the name of Judy Fairbrother. And we sat together and talked. Between the sessions of the assembly, we talked, and then at the end of the Sunday session, I asked her on a date for the following Sunday, and she said sure. So we went out to dinner the following Sunday and began dating. Eventually, that we began dating. It was in April of 1970. We began dating. It was eventually in December of that year that I proposed her, a very awkward proposal. She had asked me, "Is this a proposal?" But anyway, then we went and got her the ring, and we were married in August of 1971. It was August 28th, 1971, we got married. On August 29th, 1972, a year and a day after our wedding, our daughter was born. And she's my only child, Dorothy. And so, I've, Judy helped me a little bit with, like I seem to be holding her like, I know you have to hold a baby carefully, but I seem to be a little overly careful. But she showed me, no, you don't have to be that. She's not that fragile. And anyway, I gradually bonded with her. Sometimes I would feed her and play games with her as I was feeding her, and she would sit in my lap and identify the different parts of my articles of clothing. Uh, and I remember when I was feeding her, she would knock over. She was learning to drink from the cup. She knocked over a cup. I would tell her, "Well, we won't cry over spilled milk." And I had this baby routine that I would go through with her when I put her bib on. And finally, I knew she had outgrown the routine when she interrupted me and goes, "Daddy, Charles, you're nuts." But anyway, we moved to Virginia in December of 1975. That time, Dorothy was 3 years old. And I would come home from work. I worked at first at a bank there, and then worked for a company that did computerized tax returns for a while, and then worked for another bank for a number of years. But I would come home from work, and Dorothy would greet me with the latest news from the neighborhood, or we'd go inside, and then she would fly to me from the stairs. Finally, it got to the point she was too big to do that, and then she was disappointed, but she understood. So, now, it was at that time when you were living in Virginia that Judy told me there was a TV movie coming on about that she wanted to watch about a program. They were teaching autistic kids, and I didn't know what that meant. And their kids are kind of off in a dream world. I thought sometimes I was like off in my own little world when I was a child, but then when I saw the movie, I saw these kids spinning their wheels endlessly on their toys, and I said, no, I didn't do that. And there were things, though, I did that were more subtle forms of that, like filling up reams of paper with counting by 76s. I did that for about 3.5 years when I was a kid. Or my tracking the top 40 hits. That was a more subtle form of the same sort of thing. But anyway, I couldn't relate to that. Then there was a young man came to be associated with our congregation who was autistic. And I saw some similarities between his behavior and some things I might have done, but I said, no, that's a little too extreme. I dismissed the similarities. And I was aware, though, that my thinking process was a lot different from that of a lot of other people. But I didn't know, wasn't a name that I could put to it. Well, eventually, as Dorothy grew up, now she was in her late teens. Actually, she was a young woman. She began to urge me to watch a movie called Rain Man. Well, one day in December of 1995, before that, let me go back to February 1995. Awake magazine had an article about autism, and I read that article, and I noticed the talks about special abilities, and saying some autistic kids have special abilities, particularly in math and music, they mentioned. And I wondered, is there a milder form of this? But then I kind of forgot about what I read until that December. I turned on the TV, and the movie Rain Man was just coming on. I said, Dorothy's been urging me to watch this movie. I need to watch it. And I quickly realized why. I could see myself as a more severe, as a less severe form of Raymond, less severe version of him. I could see, of course, I can't do the kind of math in my head that he could, but you give me 2-3 digit numbers, I can multiply them in my head with no problem. Um, drop a whole bunch of toothpicks, I won't be able to tell you exactly how many there are. But of course, the other thing is that he couldn't do a simple applied math problem. Like if I've got $1 and I spent 50 cents, how much do I have left? He couldn't figure that out. Whereas with me, applied math, that's no problem. It's the same as doing unapplied math. But I could see too how he related to a catchy commercial jingle, how he reacted to that, and that reminded me of how I reacted to some catchy phrases that I heard. So I could relate to a lot about him. And then after watching the movie, I looked up autism in the Mayo Clinic Family Medical Guide, and right at the end it said there is also a mild form of autism whose main symptom is social awkwardness. There, right away, I could see it. I began to suspect that that was me. Subsequently, I was on the phone with my mom, and I mentioned my suspicions to her. I prefaced it with, "This may sound crazy, but," and then I told her, and she said, no, it did not sound crazy to her at all. It made sense. And said that to my sister, and she said the same thing. That made sense to her too. And I think it made sense to my dad as well, although he didn't express as much agreement with it, but I think he kind of accepted that it made sense to him as well. Then a few months later, I happened to be listening to NPR radio, and an interview came on with Temple Grandin regarding the book Thinking in Pictures, which was just coming out then, had just been released, and she was talking about that book and talking a little bit about her background, and this added to my conviction that this is me. And I read the book, and I said, well, I don't really think in pictures the way she does, but as she put it, not all autistic people think in pictures. And now I've come to appreciate from her newest book, her book, Visual Thinking, that I am a visual thinker, but just a different type of visual thinker. I'm a visual spatial thinker, which explains my mathematical ability. And so that's interesting. But I subsequently called the local Autism Society, talked to the president of the local Autism Society chapter in Northern Virginia, and she referred me to a neurologist, and he made the formal diagnosis. So that time. Well, Judy had an eating disorder. She, overate her way to an early grave, and she died in August 1996. This time I had just recently been diagnosed with autism, and so that was fresh in my knowledge. And now, after Judy's death, I married Heloise, a woman whom Judy and I had met back when we first moved to Virginia. So she and I had known each other for 20 years. And I've covered a lot of the details about my courtship with Heloise and marriage to her and so on in earlier lives I've done. So I'm going to skip over that in this live, and I'm going to focus on my life and past 14, 15 years. Enjoyed a good life with Heloise. We were married in April 1997. Unfortunately, in 2010, she underwent hip surgery, and she contracted an infection and ended up dying from sepsis in December of 2010. And well, now back when I was dating Heloise back in 1996, that was when I had first met Cindy, who was a good friend of hers. Cindy came up to us, and I was visiting Connecticut because I lived in Virginia. Heloise lived in Connecticut, and so I was visiting Connecticut, and I was at her Kingdom Hall at her congregation meeting with her, and Cindy had moved to a different congregation, but she came back to this meeting this time, and she saw me sitting with Cindy, and she asked me sitting with Heloise, I should say, and she asked me, asked Heloise rather, what's up with that? Because Heloise had told all her friends she wouldn't consider marrying a white guy under any circumstances, and now here she is with one, and anyway, that's where I first met Cindy, was that time, and Heloise kept in touch with Cindy. They were good friends, and sometimes she came to visit, sometimes we visited her, and anyway, several months after Heloise's death, I realized coming home night after night to an empty apartment is not working for me. I need to look for a new wife, and I thought about it, prayed about it, ended up settling on Cindy. I called her up on a Saturday in May of 2011, and I told her I would like to get better acquainted. And she said she'd get back to me the next day, and she did. She said, okay. And so we started talking, and we began talking every day. And because we'd known each other 14 years, there were just some things we had to get to know better about each other. And anyway, and on June 25th of that year, I had come up to Connecticut and for a visit. Anyway, I took Cindy to the New Haven Green where I proposed to her. She accepted. So we went and got the ring, and we dated long distance through that summer and fall and winter, and then March of 2016, March 16th, 2012 rather, not 2016, March 16th, 2012. Getting my numbers mixed up now. Here I'm the numbers guy. But anyway, that's when we got married. We were dating. One of the things that Cindy told me, I had a rap. And that's one of the things too, that the guy who gave the wedding talk at our wedding, he mentioned that. And we went to Jamaica for our honeymoon, and that was really nice. We've enjoyed a lot of adventures together. Went to Niagara Falls, and was part of the trip in which we went to Niagara Falls for several days, and we went to Maine to visit my mom, and we stopped in Boston on the way back, and a really nice trip there. We enjoyed our cozy apartment we had in Virginia. And one thing that I'd long been awaiting, it's a goal I've been striving for a long time, finally, in June of 2014, I was appointed an elder in the congregation. And then in July of 2014, Cindy and I went to Germany as delegates to an international convention of Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany. And we really enjoyed that, meeting friends from all different parts of the world. Met some from Botswana, some from Lebanon. One couple, the husband is from Australia, the wife is from the Philippines. So really nice. Then in the following January, I learned that my job had been eliminated. My job at this computer software company I worked for had been eliminated, but that came with a big severance package, almost a year's pay. And so when I called Cindy with the news, she said, it's time for you to retire. So I retired then. And we realized, though, that Virginia cost of living was a little too expensive for us. So we moved to Charlotte, North Carolina. That's where we lived for a couple of years. And we've enjoyed our anniversary celebrations, different places we've gone. We've gone to New York one year. We went to Charleston, South Carolina. One year we stayed in the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina. But then we began thinking about buying a house, and that's when Cindy realized she really wanted to be back home near family. And that put me closer to my daughter, who's in Maine now. And so we moved to Connecticut in July of 2017. And so that's where we lived ever since. And one of the things I've enjoyed doing, particularly since retiring, is I do most of the cooking for Cindy and me. And and we sometimes will have people over for dinner, and that's always enjoyable. And one thing, I'll have to fix it again soon too, that I learned about from one of our friends in Charlotte, was about chicken shawarma. I'd never heard of chicken shawarma before, but I fixed it for Cindy and me, and we both enjoyed it. And so then I fixed it a number of times for people we invited over, and it's been a hit with everybody who's we fixed it for. And the nice thing about chicken shawarma is if you have any left over, you don't have to heat it up. You can just eat it as it is. That's called chicken shakolda. And another thing we've enjoyed is hosting card parties. We both like to play big whist, and of course, during the pandemic, that was one thing we missed doing. But we enjoyed our life together during the pandemic, even when we were cooped up. We didn't feel cooped up. It doesn't feel cooped up to me when Cindy's in the house with me, and that doesn't feel cooped up. That feels nice. And so we've enjoyed our life together, and we sometimes have gotten to go on outings. This coming weekend, we're going to a concert of the Temptations, and so we're looking forward to that. I've kept in touch with my daughter. I've been going to visit her usually once a year in the summer. And Dorothy too. Dorothy and I sometimes talk her insights about autism. We both suspect that my grandson Ronan is on the spectrum, although he's never been evaluated. He got married this past June, and so I keep in touch regularly, even via text messages with him and his wife, and with Dorothy, Ronan and Kate. That's my granddaughter-in-law, and sometimes Dorothy and I reminisce too about her childhood and things, and so that's always good. And so anyway, that's where Cindy and I too enjoying our life together. What was the last question? I'm sorry. Yeah, and there were times, especially in my childhood, I was upset and found it hard to control, and and especially growing up in childhood and teenage years, I got angry a lot, frustrated a lot, and that's something I've had to learn over time, to control that, to control anger and frustration, to control jealousy too. That was a big thing when I was growing up. My sister had all kinds of friends, and I was jealous of that, frustrated that I couldn't fit in with my peers like she could with hers. So I think that probably answers your question. Go ahead and take other questions. And swimming, that benefited me. I've enjoyed being able to swim. I didn't learn how to swim until I was 13. I think I was afraid of the water, which was a really good thing, though. I hear about all these kids these autistic kids being drawn to water, and the result drowning and things like these tragedies that occur. And I think so. Being scared of water is a good thing for me. And Dad, he wanted to understand the differences too. He wanted to understand, what was going on, and he. But I've always had a good relationship with him, and even as a grown man, he and I would talk regularly. We talked long distance. We talked sports a lot. He and I both were interested in baseball and football. I had one surviving. My sister died from cancer back in September 1997. But my brother, I don't keep in touch much with him, but I see him on Facebook sometimes, and he's a math professor at the University of Maine in Farmington. And by the way, Dorothy and I both believe that he's on the spectrum too. And so did my mom. When was the breaking moment when you realized there was something different about you? Well, I think really there was no single moment. I think all along growing up, I was aware I wasn't fitting in with my peers, but I didn't know why. And even, when I applied, social advice was given, good social advice. I tried to apply it. It still wasn't fully working. I was well aware of that. And then later on, I realized I was thinking differently, and I was reasoning differently, and but I didn't know what the difference was. I don't think there was any single breaking moment though, when I realized there was something different. I always knew. I just didn't know what it was. Oh yeah, plenty of bullying when growing up. Was one kid I remember. He came up to me in school, because the thing is, I was fully verbal, but I talked funny. Other kids said I talked funny. I talked different from other kids, and so anyway, he would ask me a question, I would answer, and he would say, "Talk like this," and I was trying to talk like it, and he'd say, "Talk like this," and he was really upset that I wasn't talking like he thought I should. And finally, a teacher comes along, and the kid's name is Mike, and she goes, "Michael, what do you think you're doing?" And she gets him away from me, but he continued to be a bully that would bother me. And there were other kids too that bullied me in other ways. They're trying to get me to do foolish things and so on. So well, of course, being autistic can contribute to anxiety, particularly when you don't know you're autistic. You don't know what the problem is, and so you're anxious about a lot of things. And my mom said when I was a teenager, she said I was always very uptight. One thing that stuck out about her. Now OCD, it's interesting because, and maybe this has changed since I read about it a number of years ago. I read the test they gave you for OCD. It was a series of true false type questions, and or questions they answer yes or no to. If you answer yes to a certain number of those questions, you have OCD. And people on the autism spectrum often answer yes to some of those questions, but not enough to qualify for an OCD diagnosis. And that was true of me. That I could answer yes to several of those questions, but not enough for the OCD diagnosis. And how I did in other classes, I'll tell you, math was my big subject. Chemistry was also another big one. When I was for Christmas, when I was 10 years old, my parents bought me a chemistry set, and I right away was fascinated with chemistry. And I soon learned, memorized the periodic table. Now there's some parts of it I'm still trying to get back into my memory, like the rare earth metals. what order they're in. But anyway, I had the whole thing memorized then, and so on. The chemistry is fascinating to me. Biology a little more of a struggle, and physics likewise. I didn't do quite as good with that. English, uh, I was more of a struggle. Struggle with writing good essays, good compositions, essays, themes, whatever the teacher called them. History also. Now I love history, but back when I was growing up, a lot of it seemed like facts for facts' sake. It seemed like raw facts, and I couldn't relate things to each other. Now, though, it's a different thing. I can look back, and I love history now. And well, I've kind of gone through the signs, the inability to fit in with other kids, the routines with things, the mathematical ability, all those things. But level one. Initially, what I was diagnosed with was Asperger's syndrome, and the terminology has changed since then. That was back in 1996, and terminology has changed in the last 29 years. So now, they speak of level one. Hi, Candy. Okay, hi, Pam. Yeah, Joel. Yeah. Well, that's good. I'm glad. In some ways, it did. One thing that I often, was commented as a negative was lack of initiative. But sometimes it's because I would get into a routine of doing things a certain way, and I wouldn't think of things that need to be done. Sometimes it was difficult for me too to really see what the business needs were, what things I had to explore for the business needs of a job. So that's one thing it did affect. On the other hand, when it came to sticking to a task, I could concentrate quite well on an assigned task. The first thought when I found out I was going to be a father was, I was thrilled at that. I think it really hit me the day Dorothy was born, when I thought, now I have an awesome responsibility to take care of, raising a child, and I thought of that. And I remember when right after Dorothy was born, just seeing her in in the nursery, and I noticed that she was looking around. I right away said, I know this is a smart child here. She's curious about the world around her. And I became determined that I would teach her the same way my dad taught me a lot of things. My dad would he would sometimes use bedtime story time to teach me different things about history that were fascinating to me as a child. And so I would do the same thing with Dorothy. And it's hard for me to express. Not really. Honey, would you say it's difficult for me to express emotions to you?
No, not hard. No.
Yeah, Cindy says it's not hard at all, and I think my daughter would agree too. Oh, it's my pleasure. Yeah, well, that's good. I'm glad it does. And I wish all this goes for all the parents that are listening today. I wish all of y'all's kids the best. Wish all of y'all's kids the best in life. It goes for Kelly Lassen's son. It goes for all of your sons and daughters around the spectrum. Just hope for the best for them. Yeah, all right. And so Nita says hi.
Hello, hello.
Cindy says hi back. Um, Sometimes interacting well with her, with the teachers, sometimes understanding where the teachers were coming from. Dorothy had to point out certain things, like that two of her teachers were good friends, and so it wasn't a good idea to say something negative about one of those teachers in front of the other teacher, things like that. So sometimes, on the other hand, I did get to give a presentation about my job at the bank when I was when one time the Dorothy's first grade class. So I got to do some things like that. Oh, it's my pleasure, Nita. Yeah, so he's a father now. Yeah, well, I'm wish him the best, and raising a child. Yeah, that's something he can do. He can do it. Okay, well, it's been my pleasure giving this live. I know my time is up, I think, at this point. All right. I'm going to, let's see, is there anything I need to do to exit, or does this automatically exit me? Okay, my pleasure.